In this lecture, we focus on the ancient civilization of Egypt, which lasted for more than 3,500 years, one of the longest-lasting civilizations in history. Egypt has been called since the 5th century BC the gift of the Nile, because without the Nile, Egypt would not have survived and flourished. There is no rain in ancient Egypt, and very little today. The Egyptian people then and now depend on the Nile as their major water source. First, we should note that Egypt is the name we apply to the civilization that grew up around the Nile around 3100 BC. That is not the name that the ancient Egyptians used to describe the area in which they lived. To them, it was Kemet, which is spelled K-M-T, with no vowels. While the Egyptians had vowel sounds, they did not, in their hieroglyphs, have letters which represented vowel sounds. So to the Egyptians, their land was Kemet, the Black Land, called that because every September the dependable, predictable flooding of the Nile occurs, and when the Nile recedes into its banks, it leaves behind a deep, rich, black soil called Kemet to the Egyptians. So what sorts of gifts did the Nile offer to the ancient Egyptians? The Egyptians received from the Nile the ability to transport goods and people by sailing up or down the Nile. That also allowed for trade, transportation, communication, and of course, a water source. Egypt used the waters of the Nile to irrigate crops, also as a water source for the people, and they used the Nile River to fish and shoot birds using a bow and arrow and, believe it or not, a retrieving cat. In ancient Egypt, Egyptian men hunted with bows and arrows and had retrieving cats, or bird cats, not bird dogs. Egypt was blessed by its geography. The Egyptians, in fact, felt so blessed by their geography that they felt heaven was Egypt, that when they died they would be resurrected, if they were properly preserved through mummification, of course, that they would be resurrected in the next life living in Egypt on the western shore of the Nile River. So to the Egyptians, Egypt was perfect. They recognized how blessed they were by their geography and natural environment. The geography and environment of Egypt offered the Egyptian people even more gifts. For example, Egypt, unlike Mesopotamia, was blessed with natural barriers. To the south, in Upper Egypt, the Egyptian civilization was protected by huge, tall mountains. On the eastern and western sides of the Nile, Egypt was protected by vast deserts. The only weak spot for Egypt was in the north at the Nile Delta on the Mediterranean Sea. When you look at a map of ancient Egypt, it is somewhat contradictory to see that Upper Egypt is in the south, Lower Egypt is in the north. What explains that? Well, Upper Egypt, in this sense, the way it is used here, means higher or upper in elevation. Lower Egypt is located in the north because it's an area of lower elevation. Something to point out at this time, the Nile is the longest river in the world. It stretches for more than 4,000 miles, and it seems to flow backwards. It flows from Upper Egypt in the south to the north and empties in the Mediterranean Sea. Most rivers around the world flow from north to south, not south to north like the Nile. The Nile actually, though, is not flowing backwards. Rivers always flow from higher to lower elevations. So, in the case of the Nile, the higher elevation is in southern Egypt. So, this river flows from south to north. The Egyptian people simply had to put in flat-bottom boats and flow with the river's current up from Upper Egypt, they would sail north to the Mediterranean Sea. Egypt was blessed by a prevailing wind that came off the Mediterranean Sea, so that if the Egyptians wanted to sail down the Nile, heading south towards Upper Egypt, all they had to do was hoist a sail. The Egyptians were truly blessed by their geography. Another example, in Egypt, humidity levels were extremely low, on average 18% humidity. This allowed for the preservation of written documents on papyrus or paper. It also allowed the Egyptians, who always produced more food than they needed. They are one of the only ancient civilizations that always had more food than they needed. They were able to stock up this extra food because they did not have to worry about humidity and moisture causing it to rot or mildew or mold. Egypt would later gain the nickname breadbasket of the ancient world. In fact, the Romans referred to Egypt as the breadbasket because in Roman times, Egypt was a major trading partner of Rome. Since the Egyptians had more food than they needed, they traded with the Romans. Another and last example of how blessed the Egyptians were by their geography and natural environment is that a natural preservative ingredient exists in the desert sands around Egypt. This ingredient is a combination of baking soda and salt called natron. The Egyptians discovered quite accidentally by simply burying people in the desert sands, that when they dug up later in the same spot, let me explain, in early Egyptian history, in what's called the Archaic period, the Egyptians did not elaborately preserve or bury their human bodies. Instead, they simply dug a hole, threw in the family member, and left that grave unmarked. So it was not uncommon for someone to dig in the same spot many years later and find a relative very well preserved. Some smart Egyptian along the way discovered there must be a connection between preserved bodies and the desert sands. Over time, the Egyptians would take the natron, the desert sand, and use it in their mummification process. So, to recap, Egypt, gift of the Nile, for all of the reasons that we have previously stated. What we're going to do briefly now is talk about the major periods of history in Egyptian civilization. Egyptian history is divided into the following categories: the Archaic period from 3100 BC to 2660 BC, the Old Kingdom from 2660 BC to 2180 BC, the First Intermediate 2180 to 2080 BC. Intermediate periods in Egyptian history mean small or many dark ages. Following the first intermediate period is the Middle Kingdom from 2080 to 1640 BC. The second intermediate period from 1640 to 1570 BC. The New Kingdom from 1570 to 1075 BC. And Egypt in decline, 1075 to 31 BC. Egypt will end as a free, independent civilization in 31 BC when the famous Queen Cleopatra, actually her title was Cleopatra VII, would lose Egypt to Rome. But we'll talk about that in a much later lecture. What I'm going to do briefly here is give you some of the major achievements of each of these periods. We're going to focus on the Second Intermediate Period and New Kingdom in our discussion of Egypt, but I just want to sort of give you the highlights of what happened before we start in the Second Intermediate Period. So in the Archaic period, around 3100 BC, Egypt begins as a civilization when it was unified by a king who is known by two names, Menes or Narmer. Menes or Narmer unified Upper and Lower Egypt. They had been separate tribal areas before Menes, but he brings them together and is the first king of a unified Egypt. In the Archaic period, Many hallmarks or staples or what we associate with Egyptian civilization developed, such as hieroglyphs, meaning priestly carvings. This was the writing of the ancient Egyptians, and unlike Mesopotamia, which had cuneiform but was not a literate society, Egypt had hieroglyphs and was a literate society. Most people in ancient Egypt could write and read hieroglyphs. Also, it is in the Archaic period that the Egyptians used irrigation ditches. Their capital is at Memphis, and they accidentally mummify bodies, as I said just a moment ago, by discovering them in the sands still preserved. In the Old Kingdom, construction of the pyramids begins with the kings Djoser and Khufu. It is also in this period that the famous Sphinx is constructed. There are about 100 pyramids that exist in Egypt still to this day. All of these pyramids were built during the Old Kingdom, before Egypt had so much as invented the wheel. A little clarification here. The wheel was invented in a period of human prehistory called the Neolithic period between 10,000 BC and 4,000 BC. The Egyptians had not yet invented the wheel when it existed in the majority of places in Asia and Europe and the Middle East at this time. The only areas not to have developed the wheel at this time were Egypt and peoples living in North, Central, and South America. So it's really amazing to think that in this period, when the Egyptians did not even have the basic wheel, they constructed massive pyramids that are architecturally and symmetrically perfect. The oldest stone buildings on the face of our planet are the pyramids. Now, I know we mentioned the ziggurats in Mesopotamia, but the pyramids were actually built before. Now, I'm not trying to lose you or complicate things, but Mesopotamian civilization predates Egypt by just a little bit, but the Mesopotamians did not come up with the idea of ziggurats until after the Egyptians had already been building pyramids. The purpose of every single pyramid was the same. It was the final resting spot or burial place of an Egyptian pharaoh. But over time, pyramids were abandoned because they became a beacon, sort of a symbol of good stuff, because the pharaoh was buried with all of the treasures that he had accumulated in his lifetime because it was believed he would need them in the afterlife. So pyramids became a dangerous burial spot, as they were the target of grave robbers who knew that good things were inside, so the pyramids were abandoned after the Old Kingdom. No other rulers after the Old Kingdom would use pyramids as their final resting place. In the first intermediate period, there is a period of political chaos. Government officials or governors called nomes gained power, and power shifted to an area in between Upper and Lower Egypt that we just simply call Middle Egypt. In the Middle Kingdom, there is recovery and political stability. Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt and Middle Egypt are getting along, and Mentuhotep reunites all three parts. In the second intermediate period, there's an invasion, which results in Bronze Age technology being brought into Egypt. More about that in a minute. In the New Kingdom, Egypt expands. Burials take place at the Valley of Kings for these pharaohs who are very famous in the New Kingdom. Egypt in decline. After the New Kingdom, Egypt will experience various invaders such as the Hittites, the Sea Peoples, the Libyans, the Cushites, the Persians, Alexander the Great, and ultimately it is the Romans that are the undoing of Egypt as a free civilization. So in our lecture, we are going to focus on, first of all, the second intermediate period, then some leaders of the New Kingdom, and then some various aspects of Egyptian culture. So let's get started with that. The second intermediate period in Egyptian history was from 1640 to 1570 BC. For the most part, Egyptian history is the same old story. Everything was hunky-dory and great for the Egyptians all the time. They had natural barriers to protect them from invasion. They had more food than they needed. The Nile was extremely predictable. The people were very happy-go-lucky, optimistic sorts, and they felt that their gods loved them and were looking out for them. Occasionally, in Egyptian history, specifically 2 times, things don't go so well for the Egyptians for a short time. We call those periods intermediate periods, and we're looking at one of them here, the Second Intermediate Period. In the Second Intermediate Period, Egypt is overrun by a group of invaders called the Hyksos. The Hyksos, amazingly, invade Egypt by way of the desert, which was located on the eastern side of the Nile, part of the vast Sahara Desert. And I know we just said that the deserts were natural barriers, so how in the world did the Hyksos make it across this vast eastern part of the Sahara Desert? Well, the Hyksos were in fact a desert people. They were used to the desert because they came from the Arabian Peninsula, or what today we would recognize as Saudi Arabia. They were a desert people. They lived in the desert. When they arrived in Egypt from 1640 to 1570, they come in waves actually, wave after wave of invaders. The Hyksos brought with them technology that the Egyptians had not yet invented themselves and had never seen. So the Hyksos invade Egypt and rule it during the Second Intermediate Period. The Egyptians are not in control of their own civilization. The Hyksos bring in with them what we call Bronze Age technology. That means they bring with them tools and weapons made of bronze, unlike the stone and wooden tools of the Egyptians. They also bring with them the wheel. Egyptians had never seen a wheel before, and the wheeled vehicles and horses of the Hyksos intimidated and frightened the Egyptians. The Egyptians had actually never seen horses either. So, at the first of this invasion, the Egyptians don't know how to respond to the Hyksos because the Hyksos have more advanced technology than they do. Fortunately, a leader emerges, Ahmose I, whose reign is circa, or around about, 1567 to 1541 BC. Ahmose I takes Bronze Age technology, borrowed and copied from the Hyksos, turns it on them, uses it against the Hyksos, and drives them out. This begins the New Kingdom. To be technically correct, the leaders of ancient Egypt were called kings until the New Kingdom, and in the New Kingdom, the title Pharaoh, meaning great house, comes into popularity. So what we turn our attention to now is the 18th dynasty, or 18th ruling family of pharaohs who ruled Egypt in the period known as the New Kingdom. These include, for our discussions, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and Ramses II. So let's talk about each. Amenhotep IV was the birth name of the pharaoh who reigned in Egypt from 1367 to 1350 BC. Over the course of his lifetime, Amenhotep IV felt that his name did not accurately reflect who he was. His wife supported him in changing his name. Her name was Nefertiti. Her name means the beautiful or the perfect. Nefertiti's name is synonymous with beauty. She was quite an attractive woman. Her husband, on the other hand, had some really odd physical characteristics. In fact, if you were to see an image of Akhenaten, and unfortunately there is not one in your textbook, but you can do an internet search and find many images of Akhenaten, you would find that Akhenaten had some very unusual physical characteristics which have mystified scholars for generations. We don't know, in other words, why he looked so strange. How does he look strange? Well, he had an extremely elongated head, a very long and protruding chin, slit-like eyes, and he had an hourglass figure, a perfect feminine figure. Many have speculated what this all means. We don't know for sure what explains Akhenaten's strange physical appearance because we've never found his mummy, We have the mummies of many Egyptian pharaohs, but his has never been found. Why is that? Well, in the 1800s, people took mummies out of Egypt and used them for parties, actually, where they would have parties with rich people, and they would unwrap a mummy and look at it, and ooh and ah, isn't that cool? Wow, that's neat. And then they would just throw it away. Also, in Great Britain, people took, this is disgusting, took mummies and pounded them up, ate them. This is cannibalism of dead bodies. They ate them as medicines. I don't understand how in the world you could ever think eating a dead Egyptian mummy would make you feel better. They also ate these mummies as aphrodisiacs, which were to, inspire certain feelings. And you can look up the word aphrodisiac if you're not following what I'm saying here. But they also used these mummies as fuel for the early trains that were invented in Great Britain. So it very well could be that Akhenaten's mummy is out there somewhere to be discovered in Egypt, or it could have been burned as train fuel, unwrapped and thrown away, eaten as a medicine or an aphrodisiac. We don't know what explains his odd appearance, but it's not just his physical looks that were weird. Amenhotep IV, or Akhenaten as he came to be known, was the world's first monotheist. The Egyptians, since their civilization began in 3100 BC, had practiced polytheism. Their religion is extremely complicated, with hundreds of gods and goddesses, some that were anthropomorphic, some were both human and animal figures combined. So, at this point, at 1367 BC, Egypt had existed as a civilization for 1,700 years before the reign of Akhenaten. For 1,700 years, the people had practiced polytheism. And along comes Amenhotep IV, who is a monotheist. And according to him, the Egyptian god that should have been held in highest esteem was the Aten, which is part of his name, Akhenaten. So why does he call himself Akhenaten? It means the Aten is pleased. What is the Aten pleased with? Well, it's being promoted as the number one god in Egypt by Akhenaten. Aten was the sun god, and what Akhenaten told the Egyptian people is you're wrong to practice polytheism. You should worship this one god. He is called the heretic pharaoh because of this. Pharaoh, of course, meaning ruler. Heretic meaning someone that does not fit in religiously with the rest of the established norm. What makes him a heretic is that he was a monotheist in a world in Egypt full of polytheists. He was extremely unpopular, so much so that he and his wife had to leave the capital of Memphis and build their own city called Amarna, where they literally bought friends and supporters. When the two died, the Egyptian people attempted to erase their memory, and it was only a chance discovery that allowed us to know anything about Akhenaten or Nefertiti at all. A little bit more about this. In Egypt, the people were not afraid of physical death because they mummified themselves and believed in resurrection. To the Egyptians, true death was to be forgotten about, was death of the name. That if people forget your name and who you were and what you were all about, your life was a waste. You never existed. So the Egyptians set out to do this to Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And it could be the reason why we haven't found their mummies too is perhaps the Egyptians destroyed their mummies or never allowed them to be mummified to begin with. What the Egyptians did was they took down any monument to Akhenaten's reign and to Nefertiti, and they also carved out the names Akhenaten and Nefertiti everywhere they existed, and used anything that bore the name of these two as building blocks or foundations for other buildings. And so it was a chance find when some archaeologists unearthed these foundation blocks with images of this strange-looking ruler, Akhenaten, and his wife Nefertiti, and then they found more statues and more documents, etc., etc. So the Egyptians almost succeeded in depriving us of knowing about Akhenaten. So these days, there are a couple of explanations that exist for his rather unique and strange appearance. Some say that what he was showing in the artwork was religious symbolism, that he wanted to be portrayed as both male and female, as the be-all, end-all, as the creator of life, being both male and female. Some have said that perhaps he was both male and female. The old word for this is hermaphrodite. Some have suggested that. Some have suggested that Amenhotep IV, or Akhenaten, was suffering from one of two genetic disorders called Froelic's or Marfan syndrome, which each one is not a sufficient explanation. It seems that he has some characteristics of each, but long story short, we don't know what explains his rather strange or unique appearance, and we probably will never know. It could be that he truly did suffer from some genetic disorder that gave him a strange physical appearance. After all, among the pharaohs of Egypt, incest was quite common. Pharaohs often married their sisters, their half-sisters, and even fathered children with their own daughters. So you can only do that for so long before it starts to have negative consequences, and it could be that this finally emerged in the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, because Akhenaten's successor, Tutankhamun, we have his mummy, and it definitely has some strange physical characteristics as well, including a very large, elongated head. So Tutankhamun reigned from 1347 to 1338 BC as the king or pharaoh of Egypt. He is commonly called King Tut, and he is known as the Boy King. Why? Because he quite literally was a boy when he ruled Egypt. Somewhere around the age of 9, he came to the throne of Egypt, and by the age of 19, he was dead. While he was too young to rule Egypt, he relied on an advisor by the name of Ai. I, spelled A-Y-E, but you don't have to worry about that, was a much older, wiser nobleman who ran the show for King Tut until he was old enough to rule Egypt. It appears that about the same time that King Tut began to assert himself as the independent leader of Egypt, he encountered the wrath of Ai, and some have suggested that it was Ai who killed Tutankhamun around 1338 BC, around Tutankhamun's 19th birthday. This is all circumstantial evidence, but it's interesting to read about. Ai did succeed Tutankhamun, so it's just circumstantial evidence here, but one of the best books in recent times written about Tut and possibilities for his demise, what could have been the reason he died so young, is a book by an Egyptologist and medical doctor named Bob Breyer, and this book is called The Murder of Tutankhamun. It's available in most bookstores and libraries. It's a short book and an extremely good read. It reads more like a murder mystery than a history textbook, and if you're interested in learning Egyptian history without feeling like you're having to learn Egyptian history, I highly recommend this book. So what is the big deal about King Tut? And certainly we would all agree that King Tut is a big deal. And that's rather ironic because King Tut was a minor pharaoh, not important in his own day at all. What makes King Tut so important in our eyes, why we think he's like a big deal, is because his is the only tomb of a pharaoh to ever be discovered completely intact and unopened. This tomb was discovered in 1922 by Howard Carter, so we associate King Tut with treasure. And what was in his tomb was unbelievable. When Carter looked into that tomb in 1922, he had someone standing behind him. "What do you see? What do you see?" And he uttered some famous words. He said, "Wonderful things. wonderful things. It was the richest archaeological find of the 20th century. Carter immediately noticed some strange things inside this tomb. It seemed that Tut had a rushed burial. Other tombs seem to have been more organized than Tut's, and so when it was first opened in 1922, Howard Carter wondered, what was the cause of death for Tut? Was it unexpected? With such a rushed burial, it would seem so. So since 1922, historians have debated, was he the victim of foul play? What happened? Long story short, his mummy has been x-rayed, MRI'd, CT scanned over and over, and the back of his skull shows blunt force trauma to the head. So that has led some, like Bob Breyer, to suspect murder or foul play, and that I was the most likely murderer. Others have said, from looking at his mummy, that Tut seemed to have suffered from some sort of genetic disorder, like Akhenaten before him. And this genetic disorder, which most scholars who are familiar with it look at King Tut's images on MRIs and CT scans and x-rays and say, yep, looks like Klippel-Feil syndrome. I'll just tell you how some describe it, and I read an article once and it stuck with me. This historian, who is also a medical doctor, described the syndrome in a very indelicate way. He said that when a person suffered from Klippel-Feil syndrome, they would have a body that resembles a pool stick with a head like a bowling ball. And when you look at the mummy of King Tut, and you can certainly find images on the internet or in other textbooks, you see that King Tut had an enormous head. Especially the back part of his head was very elongated. And in Klippel-Feil syndrome, that is the case. And the head is very heavy. It can lead to bad posture and difficulty walking. When Howard Carter opened the Tomb of Tut in 1922, he saw canes all over the tomb. And he thought, this is a kid ruler here. He didn't need canes. These must be ceremonial. But since modern scholars have said maybe Klippel-Feil syndrome was the cause of death, we've gone back and looked at those canes, and they were not ceremonial, just tossed in there. They were actually used. So some have suggested that something happened, and because of the weight of his head, his cane did not help him enough or stabilize him enough, and he fell and caused blunt force trauma to the back of his head. We'll likely never know for sure. King Tut supposedly has put a curse on his tomb, and you may have heard that before, and I'm just going to briefly touch on this. Whether or not that's true, don't know, but most tombs bear some sort of warning to those who dare defile the tomb that they'll be cursed with boils and plagues and etc., etc. Well, some people associated with opening King Tut's tomb experienced some calamities, we'll just say. For example, Howard Carter lost his favored pet, which was a little yellow canary, right after he opened the Tomb of Tut and said, "Ooh, it's a curse." And the guy who paid for this expedition into Egypt died from a mosquito bite while he was on the dig in Egypt. And so people said again, "Ooh, curse." And it's just likely to be coincidental things there. But it is true that some people who visit King Tut's tomb or any ancient tomb in Egypt can get very sick from ancient bacteria. A recent case in the 1990s saw a woman who went from the Midwest on the trip of a lifetime to Egypt to study art and ignored all the signs around in these tombs. It said, "Don't touch, don't touch." She reached out, touched the wall, couldn't help herself, got Aspergillus niger on her hands, in her lungs, and died from it. So that's probably likely what happened to other people who got sick from being around this tomb, and so some have said it's a curse. Last thing I'm going to tell you is that King Tut was married to his half-sister, and it may be hard for us to really envision this, but he and his half-sister were truly a married couple. They had children together, or at least attempted to do so. Found also in King Tut's tomb were the mummies of 2 miscarried fetuses of Tut and his young bride, who was his half-sister. Skipping ahead a bit to Ramses II, this is the last ruler of ancient Egypt that we're going to discuss in depth. Ramses II reigned from 1290 to 1224 BC and is known as the Great. What was so great about Ramses II? Well, he lived to be 90 years old, which most of the time today we would say, oh, well, that's not so special. We know people that have lived to be 90. But you have to remember that in ancient Egypt, most people only lived to be 30 years old. So this was like 3 times as old as most people. So he also had a harem of wives and mistresses, which allowed him to father over 200 children in his lifetime. He lived to be old, 90 years old, but you wouldn't know that he was in bad physical shape unless you look at his mummy and then you see evidence of arthritis and little worn nubs for teeth. But in all of the images dedicated to his reign, Ramses is always portrayed as vigorous and young, even into his 90th year. I guess it would make the Egyptians feel better to think that their ruler was young and virile than old and decrepit. So why is Ramses important in Egyptian history? A couple of things quickly here. Ramses is significant because he saved Egypt from an invasion by a group of people called the Hittites, who are described as Indo-Europeans. That means that the language they spoke originated somewhere between India and Europe. They invaded Egypt, and Ramses issued a battle invitation to them to meet him in Syria at the Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BC to decide who was the bigger, badder power, Egypt or the Hittites. In 1274, at the Battle of Kadesh, the Egyptians won and forced the Hittites to sign the very first peace treaty in all of world history. Ramses II is also believed to be the pharaoh of the Exodus story. And if you're familiar with the book of Exodus in the Old Testament, you know that according to the Bible, though I do have to tell you there's no evidence for that in Egyptian records, according to the Old Testament of the Bible, the Egyptians held some Hebrews as slave labor for building projects until one Hebrew raised at Egyptian court by the name of Moses came to their rescue. According to the book of Exodus in the Bible, Moses pleaded with the Pharaoh to, quote, let my people go, to let them out of bondage, and eventually Ramses was persuaded to do so, and in a long trip called the Exodus, the Hebrews were led out of bondage, out of Egypt by Moses. So he may be, Ramses, the Pharaoh of the Exodus. That's what most scholars and historians believe today. Also, just to briefly mention this, if ever you're in literature class, specifically English Lit 2, and you're assigned to read a famous poem by Percy Shelley entitled Ozymandias, in which he discusses a pharaoh with a quote-unquote sneer on his face, a sneer of cold command, that he seemed to be a very cold, distant, commanding, stern sort of figure. The name of that poem, Ozymandias. You may wonder, what connection does this have to Ramses at all? Well, Ozymandias is the Greek name given to Ramses the Great. So in English Lit 2, you might be asked to read Ozymandias, and you'll know that that is about Ramses the Great. Last couple of topics that we're going to discuss in Egyptian civilization are religion, social structure, and legal equality. In ancient Egypt, polytheism was a way of life except for briefly during the reign of Akhenaten, when he tried to make everyone monotheistic and worship the Aten. King Tut reversed the monotheism of Akhenaten, so throughout Egyptian history they practiced polytheism, not monotheism. The most important gods to the Egyptians were Ptah, Amun-Re, Anubis, Osiris, Isis, and Horus. I will tell you briefly here that Anubis was a very important god to the Egyptians. They viewed him as having a man's body and a dog's head, and they believed it was this god Anubis who would guide them to the afterlife and protect their mummies. Osiris was believed by the Egyptians to be the judge of the dead. The Egyptians believed that if they were properly mummified, they would be resurrected in the next life, and the first person they would meet is the god Osiris, who would reach into their mummified bodies and pull out their heart and weigh it on a scale against a feather. If the heart was light because it had not committed sin or wrongdoing, this person would be granted everlasting life in Egypt on the western shore of the Nile. If the person was bad and loaded with sin and wrongdoing, the heart would be heavy, would not balance with the feather. That heart would be thrown to a multi-headed monster, and that person would cease to exist. We know a lot about Egyptian religion and burial practices because of the Book of the Dead. It's just a listing and description of Egyptian religion and burial practices and funeral rites. We also know a lot about Egyptian religion because it was written down in hieroglyphs, which we have been able to translate since the time of Napoleon, thanks to a discovery he made called the Rosetta Stone, which was a stone with a message in hieroglyphs at the top, translated into Greek at the bottom. Because scholars knew Greek, they could use that to translate the Egyptian hieroglyphs. Without the Rosetta Stone, discovered by Napoleon in the 18th century, we would not know about Egyptian history, not to the extent that we do now. Also important to the Egyptians was mummification, a very lengthy process of preservation of a human body. It took 70 days to make an Egyptian mummy. The internal organs were removed, mummified, and preserved separately. The body cleansed, dried out with natron and desert sand, wrapped in linen, put in a coffin made to resemble the person, and put in a cave or a mass burial site. Unless the person was a pharaoh or a royal, then they would have an independent, separate burial chamber. The Egyptians, as I said before, were resurrectionists. They believed that they would be resurrected in the next life, and key to that was a preserved body. All Egyptians prepared for death from the beginning of their lives. Some people would say the Egyptians were obsessed with death. That's really not true. They were obsessed with the afterlife of living forever in their loved Egypt. They thought they were blessed to be there in life, and that's where they wanted to be in death. So they took great care to preserve their bodies. Last topic, social structure and legal equality. In Egypt, being a woman was not so bad. Really, if we were suddenly to be transported back in ancient times and given a choice where to live, Egypt would be the place. Egypt had a great deal of love and respect and appreciation for women. In fact, in Egypt, women were allowed to own property, and it is Egypt that invents the concept of alimony. That is not a modern idea. Alimony could be obtained by an Egyptian wife if she could prove that her husband was lazy, good for nothing, wouldn't take care of her and her children. She could divorce him and get alimony to support herself and her children from him. Also in Egypt, adultery was not allowed for women. I'll just briefly mention this. In Mesopotamia, the penalty for adultery was imposed on men primarily, only on a woman if her husband desired to punish her for it. In Egypt, adultery was allowed for men. In fact, it was kind of expected. But for a woman, adultery was not allowable. This is one thing we have to say about Egypt, that while they may have been liberated towards women in many other ways, not in adultery, the penalty for a woman adulterer in Egypt was that her nose was removed or cut off to make her ugly, so that adultery would not be a problem again. Women in Egypt were also allowed to be priests, or the word would be a priestess. They were also allowed to rule Egypt. Egypt is the only ancient civilization to have female rulers, and there were many of them. Two of the most famous were Hatshepsut and Cleopatra VII, and it is Cleopatra VII who is the famous Cleopatra. We know that in Egypt there was legal equality, at least on the books. Now I'll remind you that we saw in Mesopotamia, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, or legal equality did not exist in Hammurabi's code. They said it did, but a noble person who victimized a commoner did not lose his eye if the commoner lost his eye. Instead, the noble would pay. Well, in Egypt, there was no such fining of rich people and harsh punishment of commoners for the same crime. At least on the books, the punishment was the same regardless of an individual's social class, and we know this from a document called the Tale of the Eloquent Peasant, which was first copied somewhere before 1800 BC, and it reveals to us that the Egyptians did allow for legal equality and appeals in court cases. The next information that I'm going to share with you is really what I would put in the category of useless but interesting information. The last thing that you would really need to know for test purposes is about legal equality. Some of what I'm going to discuss with you next may not be appropriate for all audiences, so I warn you that if you have individuals that you would prefer do not hear information of a mature nature, you might want to pause this lecture or ask them to leave. What I'm going to discuss with you here in the last couple of minutes of this lecture is a little information about some of the achievements of the Egyptians. And I want to start with some mature subject matter, and then I'm going to quickly move away from this and go on to something else. One of the major achievements of the Egyptians, besides remarkable preservation of the dead, was the invention of birth control. And the Egyptians invented really two forms of birth control. One was a birth control pill for women that was extremely effective, but I think that you will be horrified by its ingredients. Listed among the ingredients for this very effective birth control pill in Egypt were sour milk and crocodile feces. How in the world they ever come up with that combination, I have no idea. Scholars are still mystified by that to this day. And the question immediately that follows is, if they tried that, what must they have tried before? You know, what combination of ingredients? Just boggles the mind, really. The Egyptians also invented the first condoms or prophylactic devices, and what the Egyptians used for that purpose were fish bladders. This was not a preferred method of contraception, though, so the Egyptians usually are not given credit for invention of prophylactics, though they certainly were the first. That glory is usually given to the Romans, who popularized the use of condoms. Okay, away from mature subject matter now. You've probably noticed when you look at Egyptian art that Egyptians always look the same way. For 3,500 years, the Egyptians have short, dark hair cut in a very severe bob style, we would call it, with very heavy makeup. And that is certainly representative of the Egyptian people. They found a look they liked, popularized it, and stuck with it for the whole of their civilization. Literally, an Egyptian, male or female, would not be caught dead without his or her makeup. Yes, men and women in Egypt wore makeup. They wore makeup when they left their homes every day. They even took makeup with them into the afterlife. Tombs are full of ancient Egyptian cosmetics and polished bronze pieces that they used for mirrors. Their makeup was a combination of roots and herbs and gemstones to get various colors. The Egyptians, of course, were known for their heavy green eyeshadow and dark black kohl eyeliner, which they wore very low down on the eye socket and all the way out towards the ear. They didn't stop at the eye. You sort of envision here eyeglasses or sunglasses, and that would be a perfect description for the way their eye makeup looked. It was so dark, it almost resembled eyeglasses or sunglasses. And in fact, the Egyptians are credited with inventing sunglasses. The Egyptians wore such heavy dark eye makeup to cut down on the glare from the desert sands. They also wore wigs. Since the Egyptians lived in homes with livestock kept inside their houses, body lice and head lice were a constant threat. The Egyptians solved that not by getting rid of the livestock in their homes and having cleaner homes, but by shaving their heads so that they didn't have hair for these lice to knit in or lay eggs in and root in. So they wore wigs instead, made of human hair or natural fibers, because it was much easier to take a wig off and clean it and disinfect it and pull lice out of it than it is a human head. So, as I said, that last little bit of information is completely useless. Interesting nonetheless. And that concludes our lecture on Egypt.